Okay, we're back to part two of week two lecture on neoliberalism and crisis and how this neoliberal model has shaped the current political landscape. And we were going over some of the aspects of the neoliberal model, which was instituted full force in around 1980 under Ronald Reagan. And this was in response to an economic crisis of the 1970s. That was a supply-side crisis. Capitalist class unhappy with the expansion of government, state involvement, and all of the other aspects of what we associate with the New Deal or the Capital Labor Accord during that social structure of accumulation from about 1945 to the mid-1970s. So I introduced what is now the neoliberal model and some of the consequences of it and aspects of it. So let's continue that conversation. And this was the last graph that we looked at, part one, and I wanted to break there because there's a lot to say here. This is the income tax rate for the top bracket. What that means is that the amount of income above a certain point, and let's just say for the sake of understanding this graph, if you're making anything above $1 million will be taxed at this rate, at the percentages you see in this graph. So you can see that in the 1920s, there was a little bounce there you see around 1920 when I believe that's related to World War I. Then you have a decline down to a 25% tax rate for the top bracket. And then you have the implementation of the New Deal, and you see a sharp rise in tax rates. I discussed this before. As part of the New Deal, you needed to increase government spending, government involvement, government programs, and FDR was able to implement these really, really significant large tax rates on the wealthy. And you can see it went up to 94%. 94% tax rate, top tax bracket. If you proposed anything close to that today, you'd be assassinated. But at that time, there was a need for significant government expansion, government spending to get us out of the Great Depression. And of course, then there was the wartime spending as well. And you see that from the period I'm talking about, and let's just go from 1945 to 1976, you still have an average tax rate after the war, something like 80% for the top bracket, right? And then you see, notice what happens in 1980. Boom, goes down. And it goes down further. And you have relatively low tax rates. So a progressive tax system, just so we all understand the terminology here, a progressive tax system, those who have the most money pay a higher percentage of their income in taxes than those who make less. That is the progressive, what's called egalitarian mode of taxation. We're going to talk much more about this later in the semester when we talk about fiscal policy and monetary policy. A regressive tax system is where those who make the most don't really pay much more than those who make least. And in some cases, they might actually pay less overall when you take into consideration all the taxes that are imposed on the entire population. So what you see is a high level of progressivity during this post-war boom, so to speak, and then you see it sharply decline. This is perfectly in line with the neoliberal model. Remember, you want to reduce taxes. That was one of the complaints. Taxes were too high. Here you go. You have lower taxes, okay? And here's one point I want to make. It's very important. When people say if you raise the tax rate too high, you're going to destroy the economy, you're not going to have growth, you're not going to have employment, remember that these tax rates that you see between, let's say, 1945 and 1975, roughly on average 80% top tax bracket tax rate, was during the period of the most prolific, munificent expansion of American capitalism in our history. So these high tax rates did not snuff out economic growth. That is an argument made by those who have an interest in ensuring that tax rates are low and therefore that they are not paying what I would regard as a sufficient share in a progressive tax system. So we basically have moved to a much less progressive and more regressive tax system under neoliberalism. Okay, as a result, we have seen the record levels of income and wealth inequality. This is simply one of the millions of graphs I could show you. Hopefully, if you're a sociology major, you're well familiar with these trends. If you take my introduction to sociology class, I cover this. And hopefully the other students realize that today in the United States, we have the highest level of income and wealth inequality on record. Bounces around, but basically it's the highest level. Okay, so what this graph represents, if you just look at that line, that represents the level of inequality. So when that line goes down, inequality decreases. When it goes up, inequality increases, and you can see that the levels of inequality that existed in the 2000s, prior to the 2000 financial crisis, was actually greater than the inequality that existed during the Gilded Age, as we called it, in the United States back in the 1920s. It's really a remarkable phenomenon. So people might say, well, this is what's happening in all capitalist countries. They're all going through these kinds of changes, and this is just the natural way in which capitalism has evolved. That's not correct. One thing I talk about in my social change and international development course, and maybe I'll discuss it later in the semester, is the concept of capitalisms, varieties of capitalism. There are different forms of capitalism. There are European forms, there are Asian forms, there are Nordic forms, for example, and there's American form of capitalism. You can see the difference over time. It's what has happened. In Western Europe, you don't see a reversal of the proportion of income going to the top 1% and the bottom 50%, as you see in that top chart. Notice that at one point in time, you actually had the top 1% controlling less of the national income. And of course, now they control more than the bottom 50%. If we look at wealth distribution, it's even more obscene, okay? You don't see the same pattern in Europe. So one thing you need to understand is there are institutions that exist in the United States or that exist in Europe that fundamentally impact the distribution of income in capitalist economies. And we have the most extreme form of neoliberalism in the United States, and therefore this chart gives you what the consequences of that form of neoliberalism are. Now, I talked to you earlier about this agreement that was made between capital and labor. If productivity increases, workers said, we'll let the managers decide how to organize the workplace. We're not going to, demand control over that, even though if you were socialist, you would, okay? But, American labor unions are not driven by socialism. We can talk more about the reasons for that. So they conceded that, right? But the bargain was that increases in productivity would be matched by increases in wages, in income, in salaries. And if you take an economics class, they always say that your income is a function of your productivity. Now, notice that compensation, hourly compensation in the United States, and the productivity rate move along almost identical to each other, right? Those two lines stay together. That means that productivity, the compensation levels are corresponding with the increases in productivity, which is regarded as a kind of what you would call, let's say, shared prosperity model. Notice around 1980, these two things begin to separate. They separate as part of the neoliberal model, okay? Productivity continues to rise, and compensation is flat. So the growing gap between productivity and compensation means massive level of profit in the hands of corporations and less compensation for the workers who, from a Marxist perspective, okay, are responsible for the profit. There's another way to look at it. The average income of the 1% rises dramatically. This is since basically 1980. And you've got the productivity rate going up. And then you can see the average overall wage is basically flat since 1980. Flat. Okay. So again, extreme advantage to the capacity to produce. Think about that, the capacity to produce. And high levels of profit. And growing inequality. Here's another graph. Again, the point is that the share of income that goes to labor declines dramatically under neoliberalism. We talk about the share that goes to capital, the share that goes to labor. You can see the labor share declines dramatically. Think about the long-term consequences since 1980 of this continual period of less income to labor, wage stagnation, salary stagnation, increasing income, wealth inequality. How all that shapes the political dynamics in the United States. So, I've always loved this little image. It shows you the group, Reagan and his cronies, and they're basically all laughing, okay, because it's a big joke. We told them the wealth would trickle down. They're all laughing. The joke's on us. People still believe that if you give the capitalist class everything they want so that they can maximize profit, that somehow we will all benefit. Over the last 40 years, there's absolutely no relationship between the success of capital and the capitalist class and the quality of life of the larger population. Those things have been totally severed. Okay. There you see Reagan on the left, and you see Bush over there against the wall on the right, second from the right, and Edwin Meese, and David Gergen, and what a crew. Okay. A lot more we could say about this collection of characters, but I don't want to get hung up on that. I would digress. Believe me, I would digress. So, what has happened is it hasn't trickled down. It has trickled, if that's possible. It defies the law of gravity. It trickled up. We have had since 1980 systematic redistribution of income from the bottom and the middle to the top. I want to note something because sometimes students get the wrong idea. They think, well, this is horrible. This is all Reagan. This is a Republican thing. And, we got to get the Democrats in there. Sorry to disappoint you if that's the way you feel. This is a bipartisan consensus. Neoliberalism has been practiced by both political parties. To that extent, the two political parties are not significantly different on that political economic dimension. I'm going to have more to say about that next week. Clinton, Bill Clinton, who was the president after Ronald Reagan, okay, after one term by Bush 1, okay, through the 90s, Clinton was a neoliberal. And he basically, what I would say, normalized, deepened neoliberalism, made it widely acceptable. And I'll just talk about a couple policy areas. One is the North American Free Trade Agreement, which he signed, which was totally opposed by labor. Many people believe that this would be a trade deal that would undermine the manufacturing sector, hurt workers, undermine their wages, job loss, etc. Clinton administration argued, no, this will be a big boom. It'll be a win-win. It hasn't been a win-win. And in fact, I have to say that Trump was very, very wise to go after these trade agreements when he was running for office in 2016. And the Democrats basically stuck to defending neoliberal trade agreements, which historically had destroyed communities, the working class. And I think we'll talk more about that, but I think that was a contributing factor to their loss. Clinton also instituted probably the most significant welfare reform. You wouldn't expect it maybe from a Democratic president, but he did. And this had enormous consequences for the ability of the poor and the unemployed to access government assistance. He deregulated Wall Street. Much of the financial crisis of 2007-2008 can be sourced back to the policies of the Clinton administration. And one in particular is the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act, which was put in place after the Great Depression, where you had commercial banks, okay, and you had investment banks, and those two could not mix their money. Commercial banks, where you put your money, where you put your deposit, could not take that money and put it into investment vehicles. There was a wall that prevented that from happening because that contributed to the Great Depression. But of course, Wall Street wanted access to that money, and they were very powerful, the financial oligarchy in the United States. And they were very influential in the Clinton administration, and they convinced the Clinton administration to deregulate the financial sector. And this produced, ultimately, in 2007-2008, the financial crisis. So they planted the seeds for that. So Clinton was a neoliberal. He essentially established that as a fundamental area of democratic political economic policy making. He was part of what was called the Democratic Leadership Council. And the Democratic Leadership Council emerged in the 1980s. And the idea was that the Democratic Party had to be a more conservative, and it had to pursue policies that were more favorable to the corporate sector for a variety of reasons, not least of which they were interested in the money that they could get from the corporate sector. And we will talk about a theory that helps us understand that, the investment theory of politics. Okay, so think about it. 1980, you institute the neoliberal model. You saw rising income inequality. Productivity is going up. Profits are going up. The capitalist class is doing great. Workers' compensation is stagnating. You would expect, in my model, you would expect to have a huge, huge demand-side crisis. Immediately, within by 2000, maybe even in the 1990s. Why no demand-side crisis? What forestalled the demand-side crisis? What factors help us understand why the crisis didn't occur sooner? And let me just touch on a few quick explanations. One was overwork. This is a book written by Juliet Schor, who is a graduate student at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where I got my PhD. She went on and has had a wonderful career as a, I'll say, left-leaning political economist. She wrote this book about the overworked American. So what were people doing, right? They wanted to maintain their standard of living, but their wages weren't going up. In some cases, they were suffering from downward mobility because factories had closed. They had to take jobs in other sectors. So overwork, people were taking on additional work. And in this book, and more recently, you can see that in the United States, workers in the United States work longer than workers in most industrial societies. They have to work more hours to make the money to make ends meet or to meet their desires and demands for consumer goods, whatever those happen to be. Two paycheck families. That is, rather than having one person working, you have two people working. The classic idea of the male breadwinner, right? More and more women. Some of them obviously interested in working, having careers, but many having to, despite the fact that they might not have wanted to, taking a job as well in order to combine the two incomes to make ends meet. So you have this rising level of we'll call it two paycheck families. Sometimes three paycheck families if you could get some relatives to move in with you and sort of pool your resources. Notice that the author here, somebody who I have a great deal of respect for in some ways, okay, I have some issues with her now, Elizabeth Warren, but she was an academic and she studied these things and she produced some really, really first-rate research and analysis, and she's the co-author of this book with her daughter. Now, the most important factor to understand in how this period did not produce a demand-side crisis sooner was that people turned overwork, two-paycheck family, and finally, the ultimate, and that is debt. Private household debt skyrocketed, okay? And this is based on credit cards, which is the most obvious form. But remember, in the 2000s, we had the housing bubble. The value of people's homes were rising, and people could take out home equity lines of credit using their home for collateral. And that's what people did. They refinanced, they took out home equity loans, and the debt piled up, and the debt piled up, and the debt piled up. And it all came crashing down. The best documentary that explains what happened, if you're interested in this, is it's called Inside Job. Charles Ferguson produced that documentary. Check it out. Okay, now we see consumer debt just continues to skyrocket. So the growth during the early 2000s, and at least to 2007, the growth of the American economy was debt-driven, debt-fueled. I have this term here, privatized Keynesianism, right? Because we talked about how Keynesian economics says if you want to, make sure that you have enough demand, the government has to spend on projects and redistribute income. Well, clearly, under neoliberalism, they weren't pursuing the Keynesian model, but you could think of borrowing money, okay, home equity lines of credit, private debt, okay, as privatized Keynesianism. In other words, it was those loans that gave people the money to spend to buy the goods that were being produced. And we had this sharp rise in the financial sector as more and more money was put in the hands of the wealthy. They put more and more of their money into not new factories, not new businesses, not employing more workers, not reinvesting in production. They put more and more money into the financial sector. And the financial sector was also being fueled by the housing bubble, right? So you see that the profits that corporations are making increasingly is based not on producing anything tangible. It's entirely based on the Wall Street speculative casino. That's not good for the economy. Here you see a decline in manufacturing, employment, and notice that in the financial sector, despite the fact that the financial sector is essentially accounting for a larger and larger portion of the economy and the portion of profits, it's not labor intensive. It doesn't employ large numbers of people. So the employment levels are basically flat. So you have people losing jobs in the manufacturing sector, largely finding jobs in the service sector that pays less, downward mobility. And at the same time as the financial sector is growing and people are making massive amounts of money on Wall Street, it's a small number of people who hold those positions. This contributes to higher levels of income inequality, obviously. So interestingly, the very conditions and strategies that prevented the onset of a demand-side crisis, think about this. The very conditions and strategies that prevented the onset of a demand-side crisis, primarily debt and taking on debt, when the day of reckoning finally came, the crisis was deeper and more severe than it would have been otherwise. The 2007-2008 crisis. Many of you are young. I don't know how old you were when that happened. Ask your parents. It probably impacted their home value. They might have had to foreclose. They might have had to move. They might have lost their pension because the value of the pension simply declined by 50% or more. Maybe they thought they were going to retire. They had to keep working. It affected everybody. And by the way, the financial sector that was responsible for this crisis is doing just fine today. They're making record profits, even though they engaged in all kinds of criminal and illegal activity during this period. No one went to jail. Obama did not want to prosecute anybody. Okay, so this is the same graph I showed before. The higher the line on this graph, over time, the greater the inequality. And notice that you have a demand-side crisis when you have massively high levels of income inequality. You have a supply-side crisis when inequality is at its lowest point, because that's when labor actually has a little bit of power. So just when we're getting to the point in the United States in the mid-70s, early 70s, where income inequality is coming down, the capitalist class decides, I've had enough. We had the supply-side crisis, and then we had to institute a new social structure of accumulation, which is neoliberalism. And now we see the rising level from 1980, and of course it peaks, and we had another demand-side crisis, which is what happened in 2007, 2008. Okay. I made up this. This is an image I made up, okay? Obama didn't say this. Obama was a neoliberal, okay? Despite the fact that we had this massive economic crisis comparable to, at that point, the Great Depression. It was the most significant economic crisis in the United States since the Depression. Obama comes into office, and there was hope that given the fact that we had this neoliberal model in place all these years and it created this crisis, and we had the highest levels of income and wealth inequality, we had to restructure the political economic system, as FDR had done as a result of that crisis. And people had expectations that Obama would come in and launch a new Deal. That was the phrase people were using, a New Deal. Robert Kuttner, a political economist, wrote a book about Obama coming into office and being a transformational president. Didn't happen. Hugely disappointing for many people. And much of the disappointment with the Obama period, 2 terms, is what has largely fueled the left wing of the Democratic Party and the Bernieites. We'll have a lot more to say about that. So Obama is a neoliberal. Obamacare essentially retained the private sector, for-profit healthcare system. At a certain point, he was talking about the deficit problem. There had to be cutbacks in spending. All of this is consistent with the neoliberal model. He was pushing the Trans-Pacific Partnership. That was another trade deal, which probably labor opposed it and which probably would have produced negative consequences. And again, Trump was wise when he was running for office in 2016 to criticize the Democratic Party for promoting yet another trade deal, given the consequences of NAFTA and all the others that had come before. He was very closely tied to Wall Street. The leading source of his campaign contributions in 2016 came from Wall Street, came from the financial sector. So it's no surprise when he got in office that he did not take on the financial sector and regulate them stringently and actually prosecute many of those who were guilty. He decided not to do that. He did nothing to promote progressive labor legislation to assist unions in any way. Obama gave great speeches, and he is a wonderful speaker. He uses a certain kind of rhetoric. It sounds progressive, but in terms of the actual policy, the actual actions, he did not follow through in any significant way. So we had no new social structure of accumulation. I mean, there have been books written about how is it that after the crisis of 2007, 2008, neoliberalism is still alive and breathing. and as healthy as possible, given what's happened. How could that be the case? Well, let's think about who benefits from the neoliberal system and how much power they have, and how difficult it would be, just even assuming that the Democratic Party had any interest in doing this, which I don't think they do, how difficult it would have been to restructure the economy in a way that would have cost the capitalist class and the supporters of neoliberalism. Not to mention the fact that the Democratic Party receives massive amount of campaign contributions from corporations that want this system to remain in place. This is our two-party system. More on that. So we had the great financial crisis. Then we had this period of recovery during the Obama administration's first term. So you see, let's see if I can do this without screwing it up. Here's the recovery. See it? Okay. During the recovery from 2009, 2000, this was called a recovery, okay? What percent of the income generated during that period went to the top 1% of income earners? 95%. That's called a recovery. A recovery for who? It's called a recovery because GNP wasn't negative, it was positive. Imagine that. Over the recovery, 95% of the income generated during that period went to the top 1%. This is hardly any kind of new social structure of accumulation. The way wealth and income are distributed in this country makes feudalism look like child's play. It's appalling. I'm letting my normative attachments get in the way of my lecture. Are you surprised? No, of course you're not. How could that be? I thought that was a typo when I first saw that chart. 95%, come on. Well, here's some data from 2008 through 2013 during this recovery, right? What recovered? Profits. Average workers don't get profits. Stocks. Average American doesn't really own much stock. Okay. Take a look at income. Flat. Jobs. Flat. Housing. And the toilet. Barely trying to get to the surface. What did they do for incomes? What did they do for jobs? What did they do for housing? Who, recovers from this crisis? Profits and stock. This is the beauty of American capitalism, my friends. This is an interesting graph because presumably profits are supposed to be reinvested. This is another aspect of the American economy that is very troubling. And you can see that, investment and profits, they sort of go hand in hand. Profits, reinvestment, profits, reinvestment. This is net private investment in factories, in machines, in buildings, in tangible, investment in facilities that hire people and produce goods. And notice the way in which the two lines began to diverge. Very troubling, where you have high levels of profit and you actually have declining levels of net private investment. One of the justifications for allowing capitalists to keep the profits is because presumably they will invest them. That's a heroic assumption. And you can see below some of the reasons why the profits did not translate into investment. All right, so let's talk about Trumpism, the rise of Trump. And here's basically the way I kind of look at this. There are a lot of articles written on, how Trump was able to get the Republican nomination, how he was able to win the presidency. And I had students read lots of that stuff over the past few years. I've tried to replace that with some other more contemporary things. But here's sort of the way I look at it. And again, you have to tie all this stuff together. You have to make the connections. So you have this bipartisan, neoliberal political economic policy model. By bipartisan, Democrats, Republicans, they both essentially are buying into this, right? There might be some differences between Democrats and Republicans on cultural and social issues. We're going to talk more about that. But on the fundamentals of sort of the way the economy operates, this neoliberal model, there was a lot of consensus, right? The rhetoric might have been different, but in terms of what they actually did, there wasn't much difference. Well, we know what this neoliberal model did. It produced economic inequality, it produced deprivation, it produced stagnation. And that gave rise to anger and resentment. And anger and resentment can take different forms. On the right, I don't know if you remember the Tea Party. Tea Party was sort of a right-wing, resentment of largely aimed at Obama and Obamacare, but it was driven largely by the existing economic conditions. And that produced a kind of right populism. Okay? There's different forms of populism. And I'll say more about populism because I think populism has a bad name. And it shouldn't, because it has a long, wonderful, democratic, progressive history in the United States. But there is a kind of right populism, if you want to call it that. And that translated into Trump, who promoted economic nationalism and cultural chauvinism. And I wrote a piece on that. Hopefully you read it. The double backlash boomerang, right? And I'm going to let you read that. I'm not going to talk about that here. Okay, we can maybe talk about it after you've read it. And then you have left populism, right? So at the same time, after the financial crisis, there was Occupy Wall Street, which was a left-leaning, radical indictment of capitalism and the financial sector. And that movement, okay, so you can think of the two most significant things that happened in 2016 in terms of the two parties. One was Trump on the Republican side. One was Sanders on the Democratic side. Both were driven by these movements, Tea Party, Occupy Wall Street, one on the left, one on the right, and the left populism, I call it social democratic. Some people call it democratic socialism because Sanders calls himself a democratic socialist, and that was Sanders. So think about the relationship between these economic changes, restructuring, impacting human beings, and how they respond politically, and that there are a variety of ways they could respond. Okay, read that article. I wrote it. It's very lively and it's short. I want you also to read this. I don't want to read it now because I'd like to get through this before we get to the 60-minute point. But this was written by Richard Rorty in 1998, and I want you to just read what he wrote in 1998. Because what he describes here is very prescient in terms of what ultimately happened, and I would say produced Donald Trump. Donald Trump is not a candidate that would normally emerge unless there are certain conditions that exist to give rise to Trump. Trump is a symptom. He's a symptom of the neoliberal political economic system, the resentment, the economic inequality, the ease with which people can use racism and xenophobia during those periods where people are feeling squeezed and resentful, looking for scapegoats. And I have to say, Obama was in office for 8 years, and he has to take responsibility as well. Because for many people, it was like, hey, we had George Bush, and then we had Obama. Nothing has changed. We still have the same problems. Inequality is still large. I'm still working my ass off. I don't have a secure job, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Whatever you want to say about the consequences of neoliberalism. Hey, I'm going to roll the dice. Right? I'm going to roll the dice and vote for this guy, Trump. I've given the two parties a chance, and this is somebody totally different. Maybe he'll shake things up. Michael Moore called Donald Trump a human Molotov cocktail. It's a great description, right? It's like, I'm going to throw something into the works. Well, a lot of those people probably have now realized what a mistake that was. But he has his supporters. We'll talk more about that. All right, so big debate among those who are trying to understand how it was that Trump was able to mobilize working class people. And lots of working class people voted Republican, but he got larger numbers of working class people in critical areas of the country than had been the case in the past. And so there's sort of these two theories. One is that his success was just based on racist, misogynist, xenophobic appeals to ignorant and know-nothing working class people. And there is some survey data that supports that. And there also is a different interpretation, and that is that he essentially took advantage and leveraged the fact that people had been suffering from these economic conditions for a certain period of time, right? And that produced this kind of populist rebellion. And you've got these two articles, okay? And there's been a debate going on for a while about this. I don't really think they're mutually exclusive. I think that when people are economically insecure, they're much more vulnerable and much more willing to accept and maybe be mobilized by appeals that point to the other, to immigrants, and using that as a kind of scapegoating. These appeals to nationalism, ethno-nationalism. So I don't think these two things are entirely mutually exclusive. I think they actually fit together. But there are some interesting studies, interesting survey data that shows us what's happening. This is an article, and I just put this out there because it tends to show the relationship between those areas of the country that actually lost manufacturing jobs and the extent to which that tended to play favorably into the hands of Donald Trump. And you can read this. You can actually go to the article. It's very interesting. It's a nice analysis. They say they detect an ideological realignment that is centered in trade-exposed local labor markets. And what they mean by that is labor markets, communities, regions of the United States, counties that have been negatively affected by the trade agreements that have taken place over the past 20 years. And I'll just read the bottom. We interpret these results as supporting a political economy literature that connects adverse economic conditions to support for nativist or extreme politicians. That would be, in this case, Trump. So that's an example of some of the data that has been collected. And maybe I'm a little more sympathetic to this explanation. Not that I rule out the significance of the other one. One thing that was discovered by a couple of researchers, Case and Deaton, was that, and this was just stumbled on by accident, that, mortality rates for, people aged 45 to 54 are all, going down. This is kind of a long-term trend among almost all sectors of American society, ethnic groups, et cetera. Mortality rates are going down. People are living a little longer. And then they stumbled across this where they saw that in the United States, whites, 45 to 54, non-Hispanic whites, 45 to 54. What? mortality rate is increasing. What the hell is going on? They just stumbled on this because they were doing research on something else, and they were just looking at mortality rates for some reason. Case indeed, take a look at the work. They just wrote a book titled, okay, let's just get to the meat of it, all right? Why were they dying? Okay. I looked at the causes of mortality for these people. What do you see? Poisoning. It's overdose. Suicide. Okay. Chronic liver disease associated with alcoholism. Okay. Poisoning is overdosing, opioid, etc. What the hell's going on here? Deaths of despair. That's what they call it. So what we have are people essentially killing themselves one way or another, in one form or another, based on despair. And the despair is most heavily concentrated among a group, middle class, whites, who have an expectation that their life should be a hell of a lot better, okay? Because you don't see these trends among other groups, black, brown populations. They have it very hard. They have it much more difficult. But they probably don't have the same expectations. People losing their job, being unemployed, not being able to find another job, losing their pensions, depressed, perhaps have some disability from work. They tie the crisis to the weakening position of labor, the growing power of corporations, and above all to a rapacious healthcare sector that redistributes working class wages into the pockets of the wealthy. So they talk about all of these factors coming together. You can basically say neoliberalism has created conditions which have led people to despair. People deal with this in different ways. There's the privatization of discontent, and that is, it's my fault. And you take it personally, and you take responsibility for it, and you get depressed, and then you begin to engage in behaviors, and ultimately you might believe that you should take your life. We have a very, very high suicide rate in the United States. Well, let's make all the connections we can. It turns out that the places where there was the highest rate of deaths of despair, counties, okay, were the places where Trump did the best, or where he overperformed. Meaning that, and you can read this, okay, it's very interesting study, check it out. Death and Trump. That would be the headline. Death and Trump. It's not funny. Okay, I mean, this is dark humor. Right? The counties that had the highest levels of what were described as deaths of despair, Trump overperformed. That means he did better than anyone would have expected him to do in that county for a Republican candidate. Right? Again, the key to being an analytical sociologist and social scientist is to make the connections. Neoliberal economic structuring, economic insecurity, dislocation, downward mobility, despair, political desperation. Okay, I'm in despair, I'm desperate, I'm willing to take a chance. I think that has something to do with the voting for Trump. Okay, it's not the only factor, but not insignificant. And then self-destructive behavior produces mortality, and we see there's a correlation between the mortality in those counties and the percentage of the vote for Trump. I'm going to skip that because we're getting close to the end. I have put in this PowerPoint slide presentation, and you can check these out. This is the polling that took place during the 2016 election. And you can see these social bases. We talked about that earlier, the social bases. That is what social characteristics correlate with how people voted. Right? And one thing you'll notice is that union households, that is a household that has a union member, you might expect there to be a difference between the percentage of union households that back a Democrat versus a Republican, and you can see that they get very close together with Trump. We're going to talk more about labor and unions, so I just put this up here for now. We may return to this. Right? Some reasons why union members may in fact be more conservative, or why they may not perceive much difference between the two parties, or why they might have appealed, or why they might have found Trump appealing based on the fact that he was pointing to the very trade policies that had been implemented under prior administrations, including Democratic administrations, which contributed to the difficulty for union members who have lost jobs in manufacturing. And by the way, the Democratic Party now, currently, is not appealing at all to this working class group in any significant way. Talk more about that next week. And we had lots of people in that election who voted, but they didn't even bother voting for the presidential candidates. There's a high level of political alienation. Many of you identified that as an interesting concept. Political withdrawal, political apathy, given the two parties and the choices. And just think about it now, in the midst of the most significant crisis we have ever faced as a country since the Great Depression. Look at the two candidates we have to choose from in November. Think about that. This is what the two-party system has yielded. I'll say yielded. That's the nice way to put it. Okay. So race and gender. You can see that 53% of white women supported Trump. You got the majority of white women, right? Despite the misogyny and, lots of, who knows what's going on here, right? Lots of factors come into play. So I just thought I would put these up for you to look at. And I'm going to let you examine them. Religion, union household, there we go again. What issues are most important? How you feel about international trade? I hope you find some of these interesting. Clinton did well among the LGBTQ community, obviously. All right, I have a lot of these. There's a quote by the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci, one of the great political theorists. The old is dying and the new is struggling to be born. In the interim, a great variety of morbid symptoms occur. I think we are in the interim. I think our political system has produced some morbid symptoms. It's a brilliant quote. It really describes, I think, what we're going through now. This is what I'll call the vicious cycle of neoliberalism. And the question is, and this is a big question for us, political science, political sociologists generally, how we break out of this cycle. So start at the top left. You have neoliberalism instituted in 1980 as the political economic regime that is dominant in the United States, both ideologically as well as policy-wise. It produces, as a positive effect on economic inequality. This produces an increasingly obscene concentration of political power among a very small group of people who have massive amounts of clout, wealth, capital, influence to shape their preferences in the political system. Well, what are their preferences? Their preferences are political economic policies that favor capital, which is what neoliberalism basically is. And therefore, neoliberalism as a policy, political economic regime is reinforced. More economic inequality, more concentration of wealth, more concentration of income. That translates into a concentration of political power. That political power is again generated to reinforcing the existing system. And how do we break out of this model? That's the big question. And that's what we're facing. This is the website you can go to. They're covering the 2020 campaign season. And they're focusing on the role of inequality. So if you're interested in studying this further, check that out. This is the final slide I will show you. Many of the things that were proposed by, let's say, Sanders or the progressive left wing of the Democratic Party are not foreign radical ideas that were imported from some socialist country. They actually were part of what Roosevelt wanted to implement as a second Bill of Rights. And during his 1944 State of the Union address, he said every American has the right to a job. That would mean a government job guarantee program, an adequate wage and decent living, right? Living wage, a decent home, public housing or public supported, subsidized, social housing, medical care, okay, Medicare for all, universal health care, economic protection, a social welfare state that protected people, and obviously Social Security, and a good education, a right to a good education. These things were discussed in 1944, totally discarded as policy priorities for the most part. Certainly they don't exist under neoliberalism. And I don't see this as the Bill of Rights being promoted by either party contending for presidency now. So think about these issues. Think about where we have been, where we are, where we need to go. All right. I'm just about at the 60 minutes. So thanks for listening. And I will be back next week for more.